Gerda Philipsborn, Jamia's Apajan, has evoked quite some interest in the last couple of years. We know that she was born in 1895, that her family were assimilated Jews, that her father was a businessman working in the textile industry, and that the family settled in Berlin in 1903. We also know that Gerda hesitated for a long time between a musical career as an opera singer and engagement in social work. Her meeting and friendship with Zakir Hussain, Abid Hussain, and Mohammed Mujib has often been recounted, and we know that she joined Jamia in 1932 and immediately became involved in caring for the youngest children in many different roles, generally helping wherever she was needed. She passed away in 1943 and is buried in Jamia's graveyard. We know less about what she brought to Jamia, her intellectual background, her ideas, her experiences, how this marked the long conversations she had with the men and women of Jamia, and how this shaped the work she did. This is what my talk today will focus on. As for many of her generation, the First World War was a crucial experience. It shook their faith in progress and led them to long for salvation, for a simpler life in contact with nature, for the regeneration of their vital forces through contact with the past and with those who have not yet been corrupted by modernity as they saw it. Gerda was friends with Siegfried Lehmann, a medical doctor who in the last year of the war founded a settlement in Berlin for the children of the Jews who fled and were still fleeing violence in Eastern Europe. But their endeavor was more than the usual social work. They were supported by Martin Buber, the great German Jewish philosopher, who believed that renewal and regeneration of the Jewish community was possible only through an engagement with those Eastern Jews who had preserved their religious heritage and were, as he saw it, a living embodiment of the past. The young social workers, assimilated Western Jews like Gerda, had as much to learn from the children and their parents as they had to give to them. They were also supported by Gustav Landauer, a socialist with anarchist leanings, who saw in these settlements a nucleus of a future society in which groups autonomously organized their lives and dispensed with the state. So you have on the one hand the Zionist, almost Orientalist interpretation of the Eastern Jews, and you have on the other hand a pronounced leftist influence of anarchist and anarcho-syndicalists. We have often heard about the influence the academic teachers of Zakir Hussain and Abid Hussain had on them, Eduard Spranger and Georg Kerschensteiner, but also their landlord, Wilhelm Schwaner. They were important representatives of the life reform movement and linked to it the attempts to reform education. But German life reform and new education came in many different shapes. And these men, and this is really something important which usually falls out of the narrative as far as Jamia is concerned, these men represented its most conservative, militaristic, and right-wing to the extent of being racist, anti-Semitic, and völkisch, not an influence that we associate with Jamia. So if everyone is so convinced that these men had such an influence on the triumvirate, we have to explain in some way or the other how a racist, militaristic, and anti-Semitic influence ends up in building up something like Jamia, which was rather the contrary. Gerda brought the students into contact with another strand of life reform and new education, a leftist and democratic movement, as well as one focused on the creative potential of the children and their capacity to contribute to the organization of their own education. And that already sounds much more like the influence that was carried from Germany to Jamia. If there was an influence, it was rather the Gerda influence than Eduard Spranger and his likes. Like so many middle-class families, the Philipsborns too had been hit hard by the economic crisis of 1923 and its aftermath. This was one of the reasons why Gerda started training as a kindergartner in the Pestalozzi-Fröbel House, one of the foremost addresses in Berlin for training young women in social work. As the name already indicates, it brought together the teaching of two of the stalwarts of education of early childhood. The 18th century Swiss pedagogue Pestalozzi, who foregrounded the importance of experience in educating young people, and attempted to integrate the training of the heart, the hand, and the mind. And Fröbel, who invented the kindergarten in the 19th century, focusing on a family-like atmosphere and on the importance of play. It was his niece, Henriette Schrader-Breimann, who founded the Pestalozzi-Fröbel House, where Gerda then trained, further underlining the importance of what was called at that time spiritual motherhood. Women, her argument went, through their motherly qualities could contribute something that men couldn't. This was important for education, especially the education of the youngest, as nature had endowed women with the character needed to understand children and to teach them. But motherliness at the same time was also the remedy for an over-modernized society seen as a hyper-masculine society. Henriette Schrader-Breimann said that although motherliness came naturally to young women, this did not mean that they did not need professional training, addressing their hearts as much as their brains. They were to be schooled in pedagogy, in psychology, but also in all the sciences they needed to understand the society for which they were educating the children. Mirroring the holistic approach of this educational model, the training of the kindergartners combined theory and practice, and they also learned all the crafts they were to teach the children. Everything from music, games, woodwork, candle making, and the paper and cardboard work for which the Fröbel pedagogy is famous. And again, those of you who are familiar with the Jamia history see where it all ends. I've already mentioned the friendship that developed between the three Indian students and Gerda, and notably between Zakir Hussain and Gerda. Leela Gandhi has written about friendship as a category in global history, as the force that allows ideas and practices to travel across continents and to make them resonate in very different contexts. We have often looked at history as if emotions did not matter. Yes, we can trace how ideas of new education traveled. We can look at similarities between German new education, the working school, and Gandhian ideas about the Indian village. We can also find a rational explanation for why Gerda was so fascinated by what the young man told her about the Indian national movement, about the Jamia, and about their ideas for the future, and why it made sense to her to pursue the idea that her qualifications could be put to use in this context. But would that really have happened without this intense, effective bond that was created in their common student days? So you have the rational explanation, and I don't deny that this is important, but is that enough if we don't consider the effective resonances and the effective bonds? Zakir Hussain decided that he wanted to devote his life to Jamia, and he easily accepted Abid Hussain to join him. In the case of Mujib, he already hesitated, as he was quite a bit younger than the others, and he came from an affluent background that Zakir Hussain found difficult to reconcile with the deprivations that Jamia would hold in store for them. But in the end, he agreed. When Gerda, in turn, pleaded to also be allowed to join, he was adamant in his refusal, deciding that these hardships were not something that she would be able to face, and perhaps also wondering what her role as a young unmarried woman could be in the Jamia Biradari. Gerda gave in for the time being. Once the students had submitted their thesis, they returned to India, taking up positions of responsibility at Jamia. Zakir Hussain became the Sheikh al-Jamia while he was not yet 30. Mujib taught history at the college, and Abid Hussain, beside teaching, was at the heart of everything that involved writing and literature. He served as editor for the Jamia Journal, he translated books from English and German into Urdu, and he organized the literary activities of Jamia. Meanwhile, after the world economic crisis in 1929, conditions deteriorated rapidly in Germany, and in 1932 Gerda decided that as a Jew and as a leftist, she would not remain safe. She moved first to Palestine, where her friend Sigrid Lehmann had founded a children's village. But Gerda had moved on from the Zionism of her early days and soon discovered that this was not the place for her. Instead, she sent a telegram to Zakir Hussain, this time no longer asking his permission, but announcing that she would be joining Jamia. She was tired of waiting for male permissions how to organize her life. We only have Muhammad Mujib's description of what happened next, and he was a little less than sympathetic to this independent woman. Already when describing their interactions in Berlin, he had painted a picture of Zakir Hussain as a handsome young man, very attractive to German women, without in turn being moved by their attentions. Describing Gerda's arrival, he again took up this pattern, suggesting that from her side there might have been more than friendship involved. Zakir Hussain, perfect gentleman that he was, informed his wife that there was nothing in this relationship, but he had to honor her affection. Enrolling her with the staff of the primary school and introducing her as the children's Apajan further aimed to remove any suspicion of inappropriateness right from the start. The beginnings were not easy for Gerda. Zakir Hussain was no longer a student, but had to lead a large institution and secure its survival. He neither had the time nor could he be seen to be in a special relationship with Gerda. Now there were many others to discuss ideas with him, and take care of his needs was the prerogative of his wife. It did not help that her relationship with the principal of the primary school, Abdul Rafan Madoli, took quite some time to become cordial. He was a strict disciplinarian who expected everyone to stick to the schedule and do the task allotted to them. Gerda, who had never held an employment, continued to set her priorities herself, sovereignly disregarding all the rules and plans he so carefully had set up for her. But Gerda had always been good at making and keeping friends. In the beginning, we can assume it was the women of Jamia who had been the ones to look at her with a slightly worried eye. Who was this German girl? Why did she come to India? Why was she not married, and what were her intentions? But after a short time already, we see the first traces of friendships developing. What drove Modoli mad, that she always rushed off when she saw someone in need, a small child who had difficulties to adjust to the boarding house and who needed motherly attention to console him, a person who had fallen ill and needed care, must have endeared her to the women. This was not a memsahib giving orders and then keeping her distance, but someone close to the people around her, soon moving in and out of the houses without ceremony. If Gerda's history and the history of Jamia's women had been written a generation or two ago, the narrative would have been obvious. Jamia's women had been silenced by centuries of oppression. The colonial and some of the post-colonials would have told us, to the extent that they neither felt the desire for freedom nor could express it. It is only through a contact with a Western emancipated woman, the narrative continued, who showed them what freedom and independence meant, that suppressed desires awakened and that they, with the help of their Western friend, made their way into the public sphere. we're very lucky that we're no longer 2 generations ago and that that story has been told and that we can do away with it. For one, we simply don't know enough yet about the women at Jamia before Gerda's arrival, though this conference might really help. To simply assume that they were suppressed because they were Muslims and kept parda does not lead us anywhere. It could be, but then we would need sources to back up our claims, one way or the other. And even if the women were suppressed, and if Gerda had wished to revolutionize their lives, again, we don't have any sources to make that claim, she was hardly in a position to do so. And whether the women considered her a model they wanted to follow also remains to be shown. So we neither know what the women thought before she arrived, nor do we know whether she wanted to change women's lives and whether the women were at all interested in saying, wow, now we have an independent white woman here, let's all become like her. Probably it didn't happen like that. So what happened? Instead of reserving the agency for Gerda, it's more helpful to look at the group processes in which Gerda might be involved without always or ever taking a leading position. Already in 1932, Begum Ansari had invited all of the ladies to a separate assembly on the Foundation Day, at which Begum Asaf Ali held a speech on Jamia's aims and showed a film on the education of small children. Mudoli reported on the event as he reported on every event and closed with an ominous half sentence. Apa Jan was very happy that on this first occasion already 400 to 500 women had come. The next big event was the visit, we have already heard about that, of the Turkish writer and freedom fighter Halide Edip, who came in 1935 at the invitation of Dr. Ansari and gave 8 lectures at Jamia, among others including 2 lectures on the Turkish women's movement. Jamia's women found this too interesting an occasion to miss out on it. These talks, the personal encounters they had with Halide Edip, and the frequent presence of Amjad Banu Begum, the widow of Muhammad Ali, led to further conversations among the women and probably have been among the experiences that were crucial for them to take a more active and public role in the years to come. The easiest way for them to try out new forms of engagement was writing for the Payam-e Ta'lim, and many of the Jamia women, as well as women from outside of Jamia, started contributing stories for children. It probably helped that Gerda herself became more involved in the journal after 1935, bringing together her training as a Fröbel kindergartner with the interest Jamia had in manual labor and all forms of education, which had the children use not only their intellect but also their hands and their body as well. She had regular columns on making toys of paper and cardboard. In 1937, Gerda headed a major initiative in calling the children to become more involved in the Payam-e Ta'lim through the foundation of associations of their own, wherever a group of readers of the journals could come together. Every month, she published a long letter to these Payam-e Biradari. So it's a Biradari of those who are reading the Payam-e Ta'lim. Children were excited to become members of this Biradari, and they became involved at all levels. They discussed the design of the badge they received as proof of their membership. They debated whether they wanted a flag and how it should look like. They gave their feedback on the new motto of the association, which also figured prominently on the title page of the Payam-e Ta'lim for some time, Jago or Jagao, waking up and awaken others, taking up a classical rallying cry from the reform movements, and especially those reform movements involving the younger generation. But it was with the girls that her relationship was particularly affectionate. The girls responded in the same heartfelt language. Little Zakia Umar wrote her a letter from Hadwai, which bears to be quoted at some length. Dear Apajan, yesterday I received the Payam-e Ta'lim. I have read it quickly. I already have sent you 2 letters, but I did not receive an answer. Apajan responds to others, so why not to me? Is it because I'm still so young? When I've written 1 or 2 pages, I want to play. But Apajan, I can already read quite well. I pray every day that I might grow quickly. We have traveled here on holiday. What shall I say, Apajan? What a beautiful place. How lovely would it be if you could come. The mangoes, particularly, are very tasty. The wedding of my dolls takes place on the 19th of this month and the farewell ceremony on the 20th. My dearest Apajan, please come for some time. Take the early morning train. Then, if you're in a great rush, you can go back on the same day. My Apajan, I cannot tell you how happy this would make me. These activities and Apajan's support in turn gave the girls the confidence they needed to voice their annoyance with some of the editorial decisions of the Payam Talim. Zohra Khatun wrote, "When I read that the article on embroidery was not published, I got really angry. Girls don't find Payam Talim interesting. There's so much for the boys. What would be the problem to have 1 page for girls only?" To this, Ghulam Yazdani from Hyderabad replied that he did agree with the editors. If articles on embroidery were printed, this would diminish the quality of the Payam Talim. Instead, they should be published in a journal only for girls. Gerda prevailed, and her girls got more than just a page, but only for a couple of years, a whole section in the journal was devoted to the girls, further strengthening the affectionate bond between her and her girls. These spaces, however, were not acquired once and for all. When Gerda was interned in 1914, it was Muhammad Hassin Hassan, the editor, and some of his male friends who took over the care for the Payami Biradari. And quickly it came to resemble the Boy Scout activities, complete with hikes, campfires, and drill. While some of the boys loved these adventures, it effectively cut out the girls again, and they longed for their Apajan. But when she came back from the internment camp, she was already so ill that she couldn't take up her job any longer, and she passed away from liver cancer soon after that. Thank you very much.
Two lovely pieces, two lovely, lovely accounts. And in fact, I have so many points, I really don't know what I'm going to do. But we'll open it up. But as I said, there's so much to discuss. One thing that I noticed is that we have the prehistory of the Jamia accounts that we heard in the morning through Khurshid Khwaja, because this is the Aligarh phase of Jamia's history. And that is fascinating. Very fascinating that she actually replaced her husband when he was in jail. And she thought there was nothing remarkable about that. She'll just continue what she was doing. An extremely matter-of-fact decision to be made in the 1920s. This is pretty remarkable. And I must say that this being able to use the primary sources is absolutely invaluable in constructing not just the archive, but in allowing us to get a perspective on what this extraordinary woman was doing. What was she doing? So I want to make only 2 or 3 points before opening it up. One is we have, between Gerda Philipsborn and Khurshid Khwaja, we have 2 quite different approaches to education, at least from whatever we have heard this afternoon. What is the difference between what Gerda Philipsborn was doing with the Jamia girls' schools here and what Khurshid Khwaja was trying to do, not in the Hamidia school so much, because we didn't hear too much about that, but in her decision that the empowerment of women had to be linked to political awareness, that it could not be separated. Look at this magazine that she is editing. It is not embroidery. It is not children's stories. It is not home etiquette. It is not how to become a proficient domestic and homemaker. It is to expose the reader to what is happening in the world, to politics, to current affairs, to political issues of the time. It is to encourage them to participate as political beings, not just as women. Now, this was part of her education, at least if I have understood you correctly. This was part of her education project. I dare say if we knew more about the Hamidia school, as it evolved, this would become more apparent. In other words, this is the 1920s. This is 1922, 21, much before the question of Muslim women's education comes to the fore as a debatable issue. She is already and in full awareness doing what she thinks should be the purpose or the objective of educating women, which is not only to educate them, give them a religious education or a secular education that is domesticated, but to make them into active, public, available for public participation. At least this is how I have understood both papers, but I may have been reading more into them than is merited. The second very important point that I think very important sort of difference is that there was a very deliberate engagement with the question of nationalism as far as Khurshid Khwaja was concerned. That is to say that her involvement in Gandhian politics or in the freedom movement via that stream enabled her to actually engage with the question of nationalism, perhaps differently from the women in Jamia when it moved to Karol Bagh and then to Okhla, and their perspective on what constituted an education for women. I think that this difference is also something that we perhaps could think about. That active participation via the Indian National Congress, via her engagement with the Khilafat movement, via Gandhism, is a pointer to the kind of public participation, the women in the public sphere, that when they enter, what is it that distinguishes their participation as women? Is there such a thing that we need to look at all? I mean, should we assume that there is a difference, or should we simply say, look, they participated like anybody else? That a male Gandhian worker was the same as a female Gandhian worker. There was no difference there was no gendering of that participation. Can we say that? Or are we to look at it as, and I think I could be quite wrong, but I think that if we were to deconstruct what Khurshid Khwaja was doing through the magazine and through her political participation, her individual political participation, we might get some clues into this. And the last point I will make, which I made in the beginning, is what constitutes the archive? As if we are to consider seriously the question of women in public life, how do we go about making that archive? One minor point that strikes me, and it comes from, of course, Leela Gandhi's observation on friendship. And I thought this 10-year overlap between Saleha Abid Hussain and Gerda Philipsborn, and that very deep friendship, that bond that everyone has commented on, was there any exchange between them in writing? Is there something there that we need to that we can look at? Because this business of the bond between women, and I'm saying this because it's a little bit of an aside, but I'm saying it only because we are talking about how that archive is to be constituted. I have been looking at letters exchanged between Ismat Chugtai and Wajida Tabassum. And I'm thinking to myself, why is it that we haven't ever looked at letters between women writers as constituting an essential element in their literary practice? Because what are they discussing? What are they discussing when they exchange these letters? And so I was struck by this 10-year overlap between both these women, both active, both here, both very involved. And yet, what do we know about that friendship? Do we know anything about it? And Margaret, I am extremely interested in knowing how Zakir Hussain would honor her affection, quote unquote.
I'm looking for the archive.
What does that mean?
I'm looking for the archive.
Okay. Say that.
Yeah, I have a bit of a comment and just something based on what you said. I'm just going to stand up. Just let me start with the archive because Raza and I are working on a big project of archive. So I have not come across any correspondence between Saleha Abid Hussain and Gerda Philipsborn, and I don't think if we haven't come across, I don't think there'll be anyone. But one point I want to make, and I'm so fascinated by both the presentations, but one point that you made, Ritu, you know, this thing about, you said at when you started your, you know, your summary of these two papers, you said Begum Khurshid Khwaja took up the work, you know, of her husband. When very, very interesting. The analogy of that is what Nishat and Azra presented when they were doing Saleha Abid Hussain. Azra, the heroine of Saleha Abid Hussain's first novel, when Ansar went to jail, you know, they just came and they took him away, and he was running this very, very important newspaper. She quietly just took up that, and that whole scene is just, it's so amazing that she also went into the office. She also interacted with whoever were there, Ansars. So this is very interesting. Now, Begum Khurshid Khwaja was much earlier, as Dr. Farooqi said, much earlier. So maybe there was something that she gathered from there. But how interesting that she just walked into Ansar's journalism, that Begum Khurshid Khwaja just walked into her husband's, you know, endeavors in the freedom movement. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you. Thank you.
बेगम खुर्शीद ख्वाजा के जो नवासे हैं तारिक हसन साहब, उनके पास हिंद के कुछ शुमारे हैं जो मुझे तो सिर्फ एक या दो उन्होंने दिखाए, मगर उसके जो हालत है बहुत बोसीदा है और कुछ दिनों में वो सब हो जाएगी। अगर वो कोशिश की जाए कि वो जामिया उसको प्रिजर्व कर ले या कोई और ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ऐसी है, तो वो ज़्यादा बेहतर है कि और भी चीज़ें हो सकता उससे क्लियर हों, और जो क्लैरिटी जो है, क्योंकि मैंने सिर्फ ये जो पेपर है वो एक ही इशू मुझे सितंबर 1920 का वो जून से निकल रहा था और वीकली निकल रहा था, और तो ये एक कोशिश की जा सकती है कि
Perhaps to the question of archive, because that's something that has really been troubling me when I was writing the biography of Gerda now, because there is hardly anything in her own voice. And I think we need to look beyond that. So the way I figured my way into her life is to to work with the image of a ghost. So it's a ghost whom you can't see in your direct vision, but sometimes a ghost appears in your peripheral vision, and you can trace the rooms, you can describe the rooms through which a ghost has walked through. You can see what the ghost must have seen, even if you don't see the ghost, him or herself in that case. So I think even for those cases where I didn't have anything in Abajan's own words, I have lots of material where I can either have a photographic archive, what she has seen, so for instance, for the Pestalozzi Fröbel house, I don't have anything that she ever was there. So their archive, they still have an archive, but she doesn't figure in the archive. So the way I found out that she ever was there was through a one-liner in the welcome notice on her in the Jamia Risala. So then I could place her there. And then from knowing that she was there, I could start looking for other documentations on this room and on this space. And I found texts by other women, so not by Gerda herself, but of people who were there in the same 1 or 2 years that she must have been there. And it's expanding the notion of the archive, because the way we have been trained is always you look for the original source, you look for the eco documents, etc. But if we expand that, if we see what perhaps the people she was in conversation with, they have left an archive, or the institution has left an archive, or we have a photographic archive, or we have other reports on sounds, on tastes, on whatsoever. So I think it really forces us to be incredibly creative if we work with an archive which is only partially there. And we always run into this despair to say, why aren't there letters between Gerda and Saliha Abid? We know that Gerda and Zakir Hussain corresponded in the 6 years between he left Berlin and she joined him in Jamia. These letters might still be somewhere. I've worked hard to trace them, but at the moment I haven't found them. So it is this despair to say, I want these letters, I want the original. But if we can't get them, let's think together about what are the substitutes, what we can use to still get at the voice of the women.
I think that's a very important question. And of course, anyone who has done any kind of research in this manner knows that it's a forensic activity. It is not something that we can, and we all know that women didn't write. So first of all, there is no written record. I mean, that is one source that is more or less absent, more or less. It is more in some cases, less in others, but we know for a fact that. So then what do we do? As Margrit was saying, okay, my question regarding Gerda Philipsborn and Saliha Abed Hussain was in the context of friendship, to see what was it, how was this friendship articulated? Was it articulated at all? Of course, they were in the same environment, no need to write to each other. I mean, I don't write to Zoya, she didn't write, of course, we exchange emails all the time. Okay, no, what I'm, not to be frivolous, but to say, look, how is this friendship articulated? And can that be a resource for us, is what I'm saying. Now, for that, in the period, in the decades that we are thinking of, 20s, 30s, up until the 40s, some women were fortunate enough to write. The women we've been talking about today, yes, all of them wrote. But there are scores of others who didn't. Now, the question of class came up this morning, that these are women of privilege. Of course, they are women of privilege, and women of privilege had the access to education. They were able to read and write. What about those who had access to none of this? Is that history, or is that archive a black hole? Is it, then how do we write that history? Is it possible then for us to write any history at all about that? So the business of expanding the archive, of course, is precisely this, but it also means that we must know how that expansion is to be done. And there may well be other people's writing on it. There may well be other documentary material, but then that calls for a very particular kind of reading of that material and a very particular kind of analysis of that material as well. So I know that Margaret can't answer my question, but you see, why this Zakir Hussein's thing is so interesting. Here is a friendship. We know what those transcontinental male-female friendships were at that time. There's enough recorded stuff about that. Okay. And one understands perfectly that this must be discreet. Nevertheless, he does say, I must honor her affection. What does that mean? I mean, no, I'm just saying that Margaret is doing her biography, but she says she doesn't have much material. No, all I'm saying is that these questions are this is a frivolous question, but there are very many more serious questions that are riddles like this one, that one definitely comes upon if one is researching and looking into women's lives, especially when they enter the public sphere, because then they will be subject to all kinds of speculation. And it is in order to not scandalize that speculation that we have to know how to approach an archive at all. Anyway, it's open. Sorry, I've taken too much time.
Mine is a very brief and very ignorant question. Did these women, I mean Khurshid and Azra of the novel, continue the work once their husbands were back from jail? Because we have the example of women in the world wars in Europe, what they did during the war and how they were sent back to their homes after the war.
As I got only one newspaper, one issue, I don't have as much knowledge about continuation of, but her work is continue for freedom movement since 1946 and 47, and for empowerment of education and all these things, they continue with shoulder to shoulder with husband.
I think she meant at Jamia.
Yes, Jamia, and with then later Hamidia College.
Yeah, may I? Yeah, very interesting presentations, very engaging ones, both of them. I have a question for both of you. Asad साहब पहले आपके लिए क्योंकि आपने पहले present किया. That was a phase when Begum Khurshid Khwaja was working. It was a phase where Muslims were being very attractive to the Muslim League, and yet this family was very, very Gandhian. Would you like to say something about that? And there's another question, yeah, for Margaret. We've all been talking about communicating, letters, writing. What was the language by means of which they were communicating? I mean, she was German. Did she know Urdu? Or was she speaking in English? What was it? Thank you. Yeah. The whole family has been, but were there no inclinations towards the Muslim League at that time? Nothing at all. Not this family.
Sorry, I just have a quick question. I'll ask a very quick question, sorry, and of course I'll pass the mic. This is a question for Margaret. It was a fascinating presentation. My question is very specific. You referred, if I'm not mistaken, to Eduard Spranger. And you spoke of his racist and anti-Semitic if I did not misunderstand. So I was very curious about this because you said, that he was an influence for Jamia's leading men. And I just wondered if you could elaborate further on this point because I had no idea of this and I was very intrigued. Thank you.
This is the time of Khilafat movement
Yes,
also, right? So I just wanted to know whether she was siding, or she was into the Congress movement as a Khilafat proponent or admirer, or what happened after the withdrawal of the movement? Did she continue to be supporter of Gandhi of Congress, or what happened? What was her affiliation with Khilafat more and Congress less, or more with Congress and less with Khilafat?
With more Congress.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Asad, for informing me about the Madam Khurshid. But I have neither read nor heard about her role as far as Jamia is concerned in up to say 22-23 when Jamia was transferred to Karol Bagh. Why the Jamia historian, I should say, Ghaffar Mazoli, who starts writing about Jamia as back as from 1921, he's silent about that. As far as Amir-e-Jamia, Khwaja Abdul Majid Sahib is concerned, his role as well as what he did when the first day Aligarh boys boycotted the university and started Jamia Millia. But I'm rather pained why this such a great lady was not mentioned. Now, as far as Gerda Philipsborn is concerned, I came across one article on YouTube, very interesting, and I rather came to know how autobiographical research can be done. That gentleman has published the photographs of family of Gerda Philipsborn, and I was surprised to note that she was somehow related to the Viceroy of India. When she was jailed, people have tried to persuade the administration to get her released. And I think she was there in the jail for 1.5 years or so. And when she came back from the release from the jail, entire of Jamia has celebrated and all the children have went to the railway station to receive her. Thank you very much.
Who would like to go first?
So the language question is quite easy. She was very fluent in English because part of her family was in Britain, and she must have spent some time already as a child with her cousins, and then again in the 1920s she was in Britain for 2 years. So they always communicated in English, which must have also been one of the reasons why the students went along with her so well, because they could freely express themselves, which their German was quite good, but not at the level, obviously, of their English. So they also felt more at home with her. Then the question of Spranger, yes, this is something that has really, really worried me for quite some time, because it is not only the official historiography of Jamia was always mentioned to say, well, this German connection, and Spranger was so important, and Kerschensteiner was so important, etc. But there are also texts by the three of them themselves to say he was such an important teacher for us. So it's quite clear if you read the text by Spranger, he was at least Völkisch, and so Völkisch, please don't translate it by popular, but it is really this right-wing German going back to a Germanic past in a racist way, in an exclusionary way, strongly linked to anti-Semitism, strongly linked to racism in the 1920s. And from the 1930s, he was part of the Stahlhelm, which was an NS organization. and he was one of the first to congratulate Hitler when he became chancellor, etc. So that he had a very strong affinity to NS, I think, is not something that is under dispute any longer. And also the kind of Prussian militarism was a tradition which was very strong in him. So I'm not sure how to explain that on the one hand, even his students said he had a great influence on us. And then if you look at the kind of pedagogy that was there in Jamia, you can be very sure this is not the influence. So what they say and what they take over, so the influence on the pedagogy is much more in the direction either of the left-wing German new education, so that comes through Ehrenreich and through some of these trends, and they were very close to Alfred Ehrenreich, and the other influence obviously is Dewey. So education for democracy, and you can trace that up to Said Ansari, who later became the principal of the teacher training college. He trained with Dewey and at Columbia. So these are affiliations which are very clear, and you can also see Modoli, if he did anything right, was to document the day-to-day happenings in the school and to give the examples of how really the training of the children, the education, what were the pedagogical ideas behind it. So you have a wonderful documentation on that. But how they could still hold Spranger in such an esteem, and none of them had any right-wing inclinations. So they might have been perhaps a little too patriarchal for our taste today, but they were definitely not right-wing, and they were definitely not racist. So was it that they didn't realize what was happening in Germany? Was it that they felt that at guests they were just taking what was useful for them and not bothering about the rest? Is it that for a pre-NS period, looking at these issues didn't trigger all the warning bells that it does for us today? If you have any advice on that, please tell me, because it's really one of the issues I find difficult to make sense. Not that I absolutely want to save my Jamia heroes, but just looking at the sources, this is not what they learned in what they took from Germany. The link to the Viceroy, her maternal grandfather in Kassel had a brother whose son went to England and became dominant in the English chemical industry. So he was the founder of the foremost chemical industry factories, which then almost had a monopoly before the First World War. And in the First World War, they were involved in all the supply for the army. So they became incredibly rich. They were among the richest in Britain. And then his son, so Gerda's cousin, once removed, went into politics and joined the government of Lloyd George, I think it was, and became finance minister before he then retired, because there were too many attacks on him as a Jew. And his daughter married the son of Lord Reading. So there is the direct, or even, no, she married Lord Reading himself. So there is this direct link, and Gerda tried to make use of that in 1937 when she applied for English citizenship. And we have the response letter from the British officer saying, well, Jamia, we don't really trust them. We don't know about her loyalties. And especially in her case, there is a suspicion that she might have an inclination towards communism. And the damning argument was, she is wearing qadr, so she must not be loyal and her request for citizenship was denied, and that in the end was the reason why she ended in the internment camp, where she became so ill that she died at a very, very young age. So if you want to have her as a Shahid to Qadr, I think you have a new title for her.
मैडम खिलाफत मूवमेंट के साथ तो मतलब कि शुरू में तो वो फिर जब कांग्रेस और खिलाफत मूवमेंट में वो सब यस उस वक्त तो वो साथ थी खिलाफत मूवमेंट में। वो जो हिंद निकल रहा था तो उसमें खिलाफत से रिलेटेड उनकी तहरीरें हैं, जैसे कि मुशीर उनके क़दवाई साहब के वाइफ, और ये सारी चीज़ें उस इशू में मिलती हैं। और बाद में भी खिलाफत अंगूरा और ये सारी चीज़ें उनकी। मगर जब वो मतलब कि जामिया जब यहाँ शिफ्ट हुई तो वो लोग इलाहाबाद शिफ्ट हुए। इलाहाबाद में कांग्रेस ने उनके मतलब अब्दुल मजीद ख्वाजा जो है उनको इलेक्शन के लिए कांग्रेस ने वो किया था, तो वो वहाँ से इलेक्शन के उसमें रहे। तो वो फिर उन्होंने जो है हमीदिया स्कूल का एक प्रोसेस शुरू किया वहाँ पे। ये दो चीज़ें। और दूसरी बात, जहाँ तक मुस्लिम लीग का ताल्लुक़ है, तो वो अब्दुल मजीद ख्वाजा ने नेशनलिस्ट मुस्लिम पार्टी बनाई थी अगेंस्ट द 1946 में मुस्लिम मजलिस के नाम से। और वो सारे जो मुस्लिम लीडर्स कांग्रेस के थे वो उसके बैनर के तले और वाइस रॉय से, और उस वक्त क्रिप्स मिशन आया हुआ था, उससे उनसे मुलाकात की और मुस्लिम की हम यूनाइटेड इंडिया चाहते हैं। तो ये 1946 की है तो प्योरली। और फिर उसके बाद अगर आज़ादी के बाद देखे जाएँ तो 1954-56 के इलेक्शन में उनके बेटे जो हैं जमाल ख्वाजा अलीगढ़ से कांग्रेस के MP भी रहे। तो आप क्रोनोलॉजी है पूरी असल में, वो प्योरली मतलब कांग्रेस से थी और कांग्रेस से आखिर तक हो रही, पूरी फैमिली कांग्रेस से ही।
If there are no more questions, then I believe that long-awaited tea and coffee is outside. So, doston, let us prepare.